Hello everybody, this is Katje and I welcome you to my YouTube channel this evening. I have just recently returned from my vacation or my trip back to the East Coast, where I visited some family and friends. I had a very nice time, but I'm glad to be home. It was a long trip, so it's good to be back home again, and I missed making videos. But hopefully now I will be able to make some more. So this evening I'm wearing this sort of mint green mini dress, mini skirt, and also my knee-length black leather boots. So let me model this outfit for you just a little bit. It's good to be back, and I hope everybody has had a good week or so, 10 days, however long it's been. And I have watched some of the videos from some other cross-dressers on YouTube, and so I've been enjoying those. And so this evening what I would like to do is return to one of the themes that I discussed before and go a little bit further with that. This has to do with one of the theological positions that I described. This is the so-called Tart theology, the theology of struggle. And one of the things you may recall is that recently, in one of my recent videos at least, I was explaining how there are certain considerations that emerge from the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche that call this theology into question. It sort of raises doubts about this theological position, and I spent some considerable time explaining why I believe that to be the case. Now, what I want to do this evening is continue in a similar vein. But instead of talking about Nietzsche, what I'd like to do is talk about a somewhat different writer, not really a philosopher, but certainly one of the great writers in the history of world literature, and that would be Franz Kafka, the great Czech writer who also wrote in the German language, wrote some wonderful books like The Trial, Der Prozess in German. So what I want to do is explain how certain things became clear to me during my trip in some of my leisure time. There's certain things in Kafka's writings that seem to me relevant to this theological position, and that they also call it into question. So what I want to do briefly this evening is explain to you why I take that to be the case, and I hope you will enjoy that. So let me begin by reminding us of the basic idea of this Strijd theology, this theology of struggle. And basically it depicts our experience of God, our fundamental experience of divinity, as one of trying to wrest clarity from enigma, to bring some kind of illumination from something that's very puzzling and even paradoxical, the divinity that's very paradoxical. And as we see the development of this position, what happens is that it brings to bear a certain kind of tension that unfolds in our experience with divinity. So on the one hand, divinity is something that fully pervades any particular ontological condition or any particular thing that we have at our disposal, whether it's a particular being that's not human, or a human being, or the totality of beings, or the condition of absolute nothingness, non-being, where there isn't anything at all, or even perhaps this notion of a non-metaphysical event or a non-metaphysical way of understanding the world, Reichness in German, that Heidegger discusses. Divinity fully pervades each one of those things, and so it is accessible to us in this way. On the other hand, the same divinity stands in converse opposition to us. It's something that stands immediately over against us. It's like right over there within reach, but we can't quite get it. And even more so, it's conversely beyond each one of these ontological conditions, because it's not identical with any one of them. And so what this sets up on this theological view is a kind of eternal chasing or hunting after God that has a kind of excitement to it, that brings a kind of exhilaration to it. We continue to pursue this divinity, and we gain some access to it, and yet it's still conversely opposite to us and conversely beyond us. And so this is supposed to set up this eternal excitement that energizes this theological view. Now, what I want to do in connection with Kafka is I want to describe a very similar kind of situation that emerges from Kafka's works. You know, there is this adjective in English, Kafkaesque. When we describe a certain situation as kind of weird and wonderful, but so also kind of disturbing in a certain way, it qualifies as Kafkaesque. And so there's certain situations like this that crop up over and over again in the writings of Franz Kafka. So, for example, if we go to The Trial, this very famous book, where Joseph K., the protagonist in the book, finds himself accused of committing some kind of infraction or crime, and he's summoned before a court, but he never can figure out exactly what he's been charged with, and he can never really find the the judge of this court, or who are the authorities behind this court. They're always sort of out of reach, around the corner, down the street, never can really find them. So this is a very interesting situation. It also plays out within the novel itself, in certain episodes that are either described in the novel or that maybe occur to the characters. So, for example, at one point in the novel, there's a situation described where it's almost like a story within a story, and this man comes to a gate, and there's a guard at the gate, and the man who comes to the gate wants to enter, he wants to go in, but the guard says, no, you can't come in, you cannot do that. And even if you were to come in, if I were to let you in, there are infinitely or countless many other gates beyond this one with more guards, and so you would have to get past them, so you cannot enter. So the man in this parable spends his entire life waiting at the front of the gate, trying to get access to it, talking to the warden or to the guardian, but he never can do it. And so just as he's about to die, when he comes to the end of his life, the warden tells him, or the guardian says, oh, actually, this gate was determined for you. This is your gate. And so it's a paradox that the person, on the one hand, the man is never allowed to enter the gate and go in, and yet on the other hand, he's told that this gate has been specifically determined for him. And there's always something beyond. And so in this situation, we have those components. There's a kind of weirdness about it. There's a kind of strangeness, a kind of awesomeness about this situation, so that this kind of weird vibe, if you will, pervades everything in the parable. The gate itself, the guardian of the gate, the gates and the other guardians who lie beyond that, and whatever else lies beyond it, the man himself. So this kind of strangeness pervades everything in the parable. Obviously, the gate and what lies beyond it is conversely opposite to the man who wants to enter, and so are all the other gates that are conversely beyond that. So here again, we have these three aspects of strife theology reflected in this Kafkaesque situation. Another one that I want to describe, and there are many, many more that I could go into, but I want to be brief. There's another situation that arises at the very end of the process. This is a spoiler alert. If you haven't read the book, you might want to not listen to this part of it, although I think it really isn't that serious if you know how the story ends. It's more important that you enjoy the journey, but in any event, you've been warned. So at the end of the book, Joseph K. finds these two sort of burly, almost like policeman types. They come to his apartment and they escort him out of the apartment, take him down the street, and they take him to this very remote place where it turns out that he's going to be executed for this crime that he's committed, that he doesn't know what the crime is, that he's been judged by a court, that he doesn't know what the court is or who the judge of the court is. So for whatever reason, for whatever crime he's committed, or maybe hasn't committed, he's been sentenced to death. And the novel ends with him being executed by these two burly police officer types. And just before he's executed, there's this wonderful scene where he looks up, and in the distance there's like a house with an illuminated window in it, and a figure appears in the window and sort of gestures with its arms. It's not clear whether it's waving at Kay or maybe it's doing something else, sending some kind of a signal. And Kay asks himself in the very last moments of his life, well, maybe this is the judge of the court that has sentenced me to be executed. Is it? He wants to find out, but he can't, because at that moment he's stabbed in the chest and put to death by these policemen. So once again, in this situation, we have this kind of threefold structure that's integral to strike theology. This weirdness pervades everything in the situation. The main character himself, Kay, obviously these two burly policemen, the house, this thing in the distance, the figure waving in it, the whole scene, everything that's involved in that is pervaded by this kind of mysterious, awesome presence. It's fully pervaded by that. Furthermore, the figure that appears in the window, this kind of enigmatic figure that appears in the window that gestures with its arms that Kay sees right before he dies, this obviously is conversely opposite to Kay. It stands over against him as another part of the mystery. And Kay's desire to go there and sort of enter the house and try to find out, well, all of that, what's going on, all of that lies conversely beyond. And whatever the ultimate fact of the matter is, that lies conversely beyond. We never get to the destination. It's always the carrot hanging before us, like, from the end of the stick, that's sort of being dangled in front of Kay, leading him on, and whatever he finds, he's still being led on and on. So that's the conversely beyond aspect that I mentioned in connection with strike theology. Now, how does all of this add up to a critique? How is that possible? Well, I think it's like this. In these situations, these Kafkaesque situations, what we have is God present in this situation or not? Well, it's not clear. Kafka, who was raised in the Jewish community, raised as a Jewish person, obviously is steeped in the religious teachings of that community, and that pervades his writings. When he's talking about the law, obviously that's a reference to the Mosaic law, or it could be read that way. When he's talking about some kind of quixotic or enigmatic judge, that could be understood as a kind of image of divinity. Or it might not. It might not. It might have nothing whatsoever to do with God at all. And so this Kafkaesque situation is fundamentally ambiguous. It's ambiguous whether it has anything to do with divinity or not. Now, why is that a critique of strike theology? Well, here's why it is, I think. The situation that I have described, that the strike theologian takes to be quintessential, if you will, to our experience of divinity, where there is full divinity, this strange divinity, this enigmatic divinity, fully pervades every ontological condition available to us, also stands in converse opposition to us, as well as conversely beyond us. That kind of situation maps perfectly on to a Kafkaesque situation. But then the problem is that in the Kafkaesque situation, it's not clear whether there's any divinity present or not. There could be, there also might not be. There's doubt. There's doubt. And so if this strike theologian situation is isomorphic, if you will, to the Kafkaesque situation, and in the Kafkaesque situation, it's not clear whether there's divinity. It's doubtful, not ruled out, but it's also not ruled in. It's doubtful. Then that falls back onto the situation of strike theology, the strike theological situation, where now it becomes very doubtful whether this has anything to do with divinity any more than a Kafkaesque situation does. And so the whole theological view threatens to collapse. So that's the critique that I think becomes relevant here, that I want to share with you. So that not only in Nietzsche's philosophy, but also in Kafka's fiction and his wonderful parable telling, we have grounds to call into question this earlier theological position that I certainly at times have been quite sympathetic to, but I think we see now that it's problematic and that it needs to be replaced by something like the Kierkegaardian view that I have defended in previous videos. It needs to be replaced with some kind of theological conception that is immune to this kind of doubt and to any other kind of doubt, in particular any kind of existential doubt that might arise. So that's what I wanted to talk about this evening, and I am very excited about this. I'm very happy that I had this insight during my trip back east, and I hope to develop it further, but that's what I wanted to talk about tonight. It's good to be back, and I wish everybody a wonderful evening, and I hope that you have a restful night. I look forward to talking to you about these kinds of issues more in the future, as well as some other things. But until then, this is Katje wishing everybody a wonderful night, and I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining me. Bye-bye.